Hi guys, it's Kelly here and I am back with another video for Honeybee Stamps. As promised, this is part 2 of these Love is a Rose 3 cards. So in the first video we did the watercoloring. Here is all of the finished pieces. If you missed that video, I will link it below in the description as well as at the end of the video so you can check that out. But from here, what we're doing is the original intention of my first video, which is we're going to be adding heat embossing selectively. So one of the first ways and easiest ways that you can add heat embossing to an image is to stamp it that way to begin with. So here I did not stamp my window with a frame that had a heat embossed edge, but I wanted to add it in after the fact. So with the help of a stamp positioner, in my case the Misty, I am going to line it back up, treat it with my anti-static tool, and then stamp it down in our gold metallic ink. This is Honeybee's. It's one of my favorite gold pigment inks. It works beautifully every time. So I'm just going to ink it up like regular. And you could have, like I said, you could have done this from the beginning if that was something that you knew you wanted to do. I didn't know I wanted to do it. I was adding it after the fact. And so thankfully we have the invention of the Misty, and I have no issue adding it in there. So since I treated it with my anti-static tool, I didn't really have any issues of the embossing powder sticking where I didn't want it to. If you did, you always have the option to clean it up with a paintbrush. The pick tool works well. If you just have like one or two little ones that you need to pick up. So here I'm just heat setting this until it is smooth. You can see it lined up pretty perfectly. We still have the watercolor that we added to the actual image. This is just putting in the lines and adding a fun metallic accent. This is true. All of these tips are true for any heat embossing, but I am using it to add specifically metallics. The next way that we're going to add the metallics is going to look very similar to the first, in the fact that we're going to go back in and we are going to line up the same image using our stamp positioner. So I'm just making sure that it's lined up. I like to stand up and look at it directly from the top to make sure all of my lines are lined up. And then here, I'm going to be inking it up. Now, I'm not overly concerned about where the ink is getting because we stamped in the no line coloring ink, the images. So the gold isn't going to be, it isn't going to be anything that you're really going to be able to see. But I am trying to make sure that I'm inking well the areas that I do want the embossing powder to be. So I am stamping that down. I'm stamping it twice because, again, I want to make sure everything is covered, and I'd rather stamp it twice and stamp lightly than stamp it once and press hard and blow out my lines. So now we're going to add that same gold heat embossing, but instead of just leaving it and, knocking off the excess and heat embossing the whole image, because I don't want the gold where my flowers are. I just want it on the bird cage. I'm going to go in with a paintbrush, a dry paintbrush, and a smaller one I find usually works better. And I'm just going to go in and I'm going to knock off the embossing powder anywhere that I don't want it. So I am just scooping it kind of off to the side and then knocking it right off of the edge. It did get a little tricky around, because the leaves are pretty thin. The smaller accent leaves are pretty thin. And I didn't want to not heat emboss part of the cage. So there are some areas on my leaves that do still have a little bit of gold heat embossing, but it didn't bother me any. However, the flowers have basically none. The flowers in the larger leaves have none. I was able to knock off all of that. And so it leaves me with a gold, basically a gold bird cage, and not gold heat embossed images. I like watercoloring heat embossed images, don't get me wrong, but it's a totally different look than the no line watercoloring look that I was going for. So if you prefer to heat emboss all of the images, that's fine, but I specifically wanted to show how I put gold heat embossing on some areas, but not on others, and the ways in which I have found to do so. So this is one of the ways, and again, this will work for the vast majority of images. You just go in with that paintbrush and kind of clean everything up. This does take a little bit of time, especially if you have more detailed images like the ones in this stamp set. But to me, it's totally worth it to have that super gold, metallic, beautiful birdcage. Here, I got a little overzealous and I knocked off too much of it. I knocked off the outline on the handle of the birdcage. So I just got my embossing powder back out, dumped it, just back on that little bit, and, was able to clean that up. If you knock off too much, it will still stick to the embossing powder. Here, I've switched brushes. Originally, I was using a number 2 round brush. This is a flathead, which made just getting in between the lines a little bit easier anywhere I needed to clean up. Once you're happy with the way it looks, you're just going to heat set it like normal, and then you too will also have a beautiful gold or silver or whatever bird cage that will shine, and flowers that will not. So the third way that you can add them, and add it only in specific areas, is using a marker. So I have the Distress embossing markers. This comes in a pack of 2. One is a brush nib and one is a bullet nib. It gives you 2 options for adding your details. Versamark also has one that you can use. So here, this is how I'm going to add the gold accents to these book images. So I'm going to use the bullet nib, and I am going to go in and add kind of like a gold foil to the pages, like that maybe you would see from the side of the book. I'm not adding it everywhere because I still want you to very clearly see, the pages. But I am going to add it specifically to the tops of the sections, like the page sections. And then also I added a little bit into the center where like the book binding is. This was super easy to use. Like I said, for this one, I used the bullet nib, which I actually expected to be finer, but it wasn't. It's not too here. There was one that I missed. So I just went back in and added it, and then added more embossing powder, and I had no issues. And again, because we treated with our anti-static tool, there wasn't really too much to clean up. The binding portion was just a little too solid, so I just went in there and kind of cleaned up that area to make sure that it wasn't going to be on the blue, which is the cover of my book. These worked great. These are the first times that I have used these particular markers, but they worked fantastic. I've used the Versamark marker in the past. It also works really, really well. I'm not sure what happened to mine. Probably my kids took it, but that either option will work. So using a pen to add those details. For the stack of books, I'm going to use the brush nib, which actually has a finer tip as long as you don't put down a lot of pressure. And for this one, I am adding the gold to the scroll work on the bottom book. I am adding it to the clasps on the second book, as well as the bookmark. And then for the top book, which has kind of like this line detail drawn on the spine of it, I'm adding gold to that as well. Really, really love the way that these came out. And I think it's fun to be able to go in there and add those embossed elements. For me, obviously, the metallic look specifically to certain areas and not have to do the entire image. So these are really helpful tools or techniques that I have found to add those things. Love that little scroll work detail. So now we're going to die cut them out. The Love is a Rose has, the coordinating dies. The window is from Blooming View, also has great coordinating dies. And if you've missed it up until this point, it has dies to cut out the panes as well, though we are not using those. And now we're going to move on to the background. For the backgrounds, I'm I really wanted to embrace kind of a traditional vintage. And so I'm using the Vintage Flora background stamp. It's a red rubber stamp. So if you're using your Misty, you do need to remove your foam piece. If this is not the best selling stamp from the Vintage Love release, I will be shocked. I've used this on every project that I have made thus far. It's so good. It's just a really great vintage stamp. It has some florals. It's got great fonts. It's got like the ledger book kind of script in there. Super big fan. So I am stamping on more. This is Canson Monteval watercolor paper because I wanted to create a very vintage feeling background. However, I could not bring myself to just go like straight dark brown. I wanted something a bit softer than that. And I also wanted to nod to those metallics. So I did stamp it twice. And even though I didn't ink it well, because that ink is a pigment ink and it does work so well, you can see that it stamped the full image. I don't want the full image. So I'm going to go in again. Paintbrush is going to be our best friend. And I am going to sweep away quite a bit of this because I just wanted the gold to be an accent. So I'm pretty much doing the same thing that I did when we stamped the bird cage. And I just knocked off as much as I wanted. Now, obviously you can see in the background, that the gold is slightly, you can see it just slightly. I liked the look of the full background, but I didn't want it to be completely embossed. So in order to embrace that, once I am done heat setting all of these items, and we didn't even end up, like, I used this piece 2 different ways because I like to stretch my supplies, you guys know. So I'm going to put it right back into the Misty in the same exact spot. I have not moved my stamp at all. And this time I'm going to ink it up with Antique Linen, which is a really light, warmer brown. Like a very light tan. And so I'm going to ink it up with this. And again, I didn't ink it up completely. Honestly, Distress inks don't stamp well. So I already knew it was going to be splotchy, and that's okay. If you want to stamp in Distress, then you want oxides, like if you want a clean image, but I did not. So additionally, I'm going to do a couple more pieces. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't end up using these, but it was, you'll see the pieces in other places. And honestly, I may use them to make a different card. But so this is, again, this Canson Monteval watercolor paper, and this time I'm skipping the metallic and I am just stamping in the Antique Linen, and I'm going to make 2 of those because my intention was to cut the layers, the Vintage Love layouts. So now this piece of craft is, we're going to go back in and do some of the metallic again. This is not watercolor paper. This is just regular cardstock. But it works just as well. And I love the craft with the gold. I loved the way that when I was kind of like setting up my cards and checking everything, the way that it looked with the like cream color we're getting of the Antique Linen. Now here, instead of adding the embossing ink and knocking a bunch off, I was just way more selective about where I added it, because I knew from the first time around that it was going to stick everywhere. So I just added it into a couple of places and then heat set it per usual. So these style of cards, everybody has their own style. And while they are a nod to like the layouts or a cleaner look, like the birdcage one is definitely cleaner than most people would make it. The one with the stacked books is probably cleaner than most people would make it. So it is still in my style. But like the theme of it is totally like this romantic vintage is not my jam. But that's okay. So speaking of not my jam, we're going to do some distress sprays, just to kind of give it that vintage kind of feel. So I have the Antique Linen in the spray, I am spraying that on both of the backgrounds, sometimes more, sometimes less. Now remember that craft cardstock is not watercolor paper, so I'm not adding a ton of water to that. I'm really just using the sprays, and because it is a darker background, I'm going a little bit darker using the walnut stain. For the other one, I didn't want it to be quite as dark as it was, so I added some water and then I blotted up some of the pigment. So the walnut stain is going to give a darker look, but not a ton. I did add more antique linen, and then I went in and used the walnut stain a bit softer. So this time I used a wet paintbrush to kind of pick it up, and then I could paint in those areas where I wanted it to be a bit darker without having like such concentrated pigment. The spray stains are great because they are concentrated pigment, but sometimes if you want it to be a bit lighter, that's okay, just add some water. For this craft one, I did add the picket fence spray, which is just white, and I did not spray it. I used the tubing to kind of splatter it on. Once I was happy with the way that everything looked, then I went ahead and heat set them. These are totally giving vintage vibes, but we're not going to see all of them in their entirety. I love the gold metallics. These are the two pieces that we didn't end up using. I did want to show you how I made them in case that you see them later on and you were like, I would love to do that. Also, there's a little bit of a different technique here. So I sprayed it with the antique linen. I added a little bit of water, and they felt too, like you could see too much of the stamp. Like it was just a too perfect of an image. So in order to fix that, I am adding water in specific areas, and then I am going in with a rag and I am blotting up the pigment. So this is going to give us a much lighter background. It's going to make the stamping imperfect. Now you can achieve this look by, not inking up the entirety of your stamp. But for me, it's hard not to get hard, or it's difficult not to get hard edges. When I do that, this worked much better for me because it was a very organic edge. So now all of our pieces are dry. This arch is actually the window die, but it is perfectly sized to go around the bird cage. So I am going to cut this out. This is where the layering frames come in. I cut the largest layer and the second largest layer out of those two pieces that I did not end up using, though you can see them in the photos, because I thought I was going to use them to begin with. I needed something to put my book on, so I pulled out the builder frame die, and I found one that fit my book. So I'm going to cut that out of craft, and then I will add a little bit of inking to it as well, just to make everything go together. The fall layering frames have a beautiful, like kind of detailed edge. It's one of my favorite layering sets that they've done. And so I used that on just a white piece of cardstock that had the same window frame cut out of it. The white is a little bit too stark since we have all of these like creams and ivories and crafts. And so I went in with antique linen and I just went around the edge. This is going to help highlight that detail from the die, and also, just pare down our brightness a bit. The clean white was just a bit too bright for the vintage look that we're going for. For the little shelf, I added antique linen, just kind of in general all over. And then to the bottom half of it, I am also going to add a little bit of ground espresso. And this is just going to help darken it up so that it matches everything else that's going on with the card. The last way that I will be adding any sort of metallics, like just kind of selective adding, is to give this piece of craft a border. This is trimmed down. It's just 1/8 of an inch smaller than an A2 size card because I wanted to have a white border. But I'm adding some shading to make it just a little bit more interesting. However, keep in mind, because I completely did not, that distress inks are made to stay wet longer and they're made to emboss with. So if you want all the control over where your embossing powder goes, then make sure you heat set it first. I didn't. And so that did mean I had to do a little bit of cleanup, but it was no big deal. So I'm taking the gold ink pad, I'm rubbing it on the edges, and I like a slight amount of gold, but a very organic edge. You'll see when I put this on here that a lot sticks to it, which is not what I was going for. But that's okay. It's sticking to the Distress ink. That's why it is what it is. So I'm going to go in just like we've done before with the paintbrush. If you want an organic edge and you don't want it to be a straight line, try going horizontal instead of vertical. Because I found that I was getting a very straight edge, and I did not want that. So I'm just going to, scoop it kind of out to the edges, knock off any of the excess. This is just to add in an accent. So the background isn't super boring and everything matches together. I still wanted it to be clean, but I need to stick with the theme. And again, just like before, if you knock off too much, you can always pick up more, as long as you're, till you get to where you're happy with it. I did go into the center and just use my fingers to kind of push everything to the edge to make sure that the center was super clean and the embossing was only around the edges. This is, we talked about the layering frames. Adding the gold on the edges is a great way to add a little bit of difference to make some separation between the layers. If you're using like all one color, you could just add some metallic or other colors, whatever color embossing powder you want, accents on the edges, and it'll really help kind of set it apart. But for this one, because I already had so much going on in the background of the arch, and then we have that, beautiful no line watercoloring, I didn't want it to be too overwhelming. So here I've picked out some sentiments. They're actually from both sets. I love. Oh, I love them all. Honeybee does such great sentiments. But the one in Love is a Rose, they have so many good ones. And so 2 of them have to do with birthdays. I always need birthday cards. So I picked Have a Beautiful Birthday, make this birthday one for the books. Is that not cute? And then for the other one, I chose Happy Anniversary, which is from Blooming View, because this felt very much like it could be an anniversary card, and those are good to have on hand as well. So with that said, I chose to just do gold heat embossing on white because it just felt like it fit. It felt softer. I originally was like, should I do white on craft? But I didn't want, especially for the bird cage or the window, like this large piece of craft in the middle of my window or in the middle of my bird cage. And so that's how I ended up with the gold on white. These also have coordinating dies, which I used to cut them out. And then we're finally going to get on to the building of the cards. There was so much that went into these, like so many techniques and things like that. You guys know, like, my particular style. The only reason that for this window card, I was comfortable enough using so much of the textured background is because we have that open window and it gives the place for the eye to rest without it being, super crazy busy. So the window and the background both went down flat, and then I did pop up the book over top of it to create some dimension. These are, I feel like these 3 cards, and maybe it's because I've been trying to push myself more. I don't know if you guys find this to be true or not. But I've been like struggling a little bit with the card making and the creative process. And I think a large part of it has to do with me trying to make sure I'm not making everything look the same. Because sometimes I find myself in like crafty ruts where I feel like everything I'm producing is the same color scheme, or it's the same layout, or they all have the same feel. And so trying to keep things different and fresh has been somewhat of a struggle. And this is so far outside of my normal wheelhouse. It's soft colors, it's watercolor, it's some mixed media backgrounds. it's vintage. Yeah, it's not me. But I will say, even though it took me much longer to create them, it was a great learning process. I love the way that they came out. Even though, like, if I was a person who didn't know me and I looked at them, I wouldn't say, oh, those are for sure Kelly cards. It is kind of a veer left from what I would normally do, but I'm really, really glad that I took the time to make them, because the stretching and the growing and the progressing on our art journeys happens when we try new things. So did you see all the painting on the background? That's because my daughter, little Jelly Bean, came to visit me in the craft room, and so I let her play with my watercolors, and but I'm also too cheap. P.S. By the way, don't be offended by the word cheap. I think in one of my more recent videos, I had said something like, I'm still a cheap chicken. And somebody was like, oh, it's not cheap. It's creative. It's not cheap. It's sensible. It's not cheap. Like, I am cheap and I'm not offended by it. I'm not, it's okay. I don't think it's a bad thing to be cheap. Like, I just pay attention. That's all. So anyway, but like the growing and stuff, I think totally makes it worth it, even though sometimes it does take a little bit longer because it is something new and something different. You can learn so many lessons that you can then apply to your own style that maybe you use more often. So these were fun to do something different. So I would encourage you to try something that's maybe a little bit outside of your wheelhouse. I think that you will be pleasantly surprised with the end result. So for this one, which is the bird cage, I went ahead and popped up the frame. Here I am adding some glue to the foam tape because I wanted to make sure that I had enough wiggle room time-wise before everything was adhered down. If you don't put the liquid glue on the foam tape, I mean, it's where it touches is where it sticks. So to make sure that I was going to have time to move things around if I needed to, with the frame and with the bird cage, to make sure it was all lined up, then that, like, the liquid glue is just a savior for me putting that on there. And then obviously I have a real problem with adding too much foam tape. I don't know why. Yes, I do. I don't want it to be flimsy. I want it to be securely attached. And even though most of the time I put down twice as much foam tape as needed, it makes me feel good. It makes me feel good that it's not going to go anywhere, and it's going to be flat, and it's going to be securely attached to my card. So like I said, that arch is for the window, but the birdcage fits pretty nicely in there, which I love. I love that you could use those together and get even more out of that die. This is the Have a Beautiful Birthday sentiment, and I adhered it flat, but also a little bit off to the left, because on the bottom right, I have those leaves that kind of come over, so they balance each other out. There are always with every release, pearls and rhinestones. And I originally pulled out both. I wasn't sure which I wanted to use. And the pearls just felt like softer and more romantic. This entire video, I did not know where my reverse tweezers were. And I wasn't even a person who a year ago used tweezers. But now I was... I was like, so where are they? Like, I'm having such a hard time. So I ended up using my Honeybee release tool. It's like the little pick tool to add my pearls. And it worked well, but I definitely was missing my tweezers for sure. So these are all 3 of the cards with their pearls added, all in their completion. Like I said, if you missed the watercolor, I will link that at the end. I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you so much for joining me. I always appreciate your time, and I will catch you on the next video. Bye.